Have you ever met a person who radiated evil? What were they like? Extreme narcissist. The guy sent emails to me and my boss about my poor work performance while I was sitting at my dying mother's hospital bed. When I returned from that trip a week later, he was literally standing in my office with a tape measure. Apparently, he took my absence as an opportunity to take my office permanently. I have a higher job title than this guy to top it off, and no, he didn't get the office. I went to pick up a takeout order at a restaurant bar near me. I walked inside, and there's a guy standing by the door also waiting for his takeout order. He never said a word, just stared at me the entire time he was waiting. My gut told me I was unsafe. The cashier gave him his food, and he stood there for a minute or two like he was thinking of a reason to stall. He asked the cashier for another order of wings. I texted my husband and asked if he could pick me up because this guy was giving me the creeps. As soon as my husband arrived, the creepy guy said, "Actually, I think I'm fine with a dozen. You guys enjoy those wings." And he left. I get the chills thinking about how I could have potentially been mugged or worse if I didn't listen to my gut that night. Holy crap, that is scary. To think just some random guy saw you at a restaurant and did that. Posts like this really make me wonder just how many awful people are out there. Feels like more and more every time I read these. Years back, I was working on a mural project with a nonprofit. Part of the gig was 1 day a week to teach the 7 to 12-year-olds art. There was an 8 to 10-year-old brother and sister in one group. The brother bullied the sister mercilessly. No other kid would get near him. They all knew he was trouble. We separated the two, but once your back was turned, he was right back, hitting her and even biting her. The last straw was when he took a newly sharpened pencil and straight up stabbed her in the hand. There was screaming, crying, blood everywhere. They called the parents, but I insisted on her being taken to the hospital as the pencil was halfway through her hand. The brother had no remorse and even a smirk on his face. His eyes were very dark and dead-looking, like in shows where they show a pic of a killer and people describe them being dead-eyed. The ambulance comes as the parents get there. This is clearly not the first time something like this has happened. Because they didn't complete the activity, the nonprofit wanted the two back for the next week. I flat out refused, which caused a big deal. I put my foot down and wouldn't relent. I told them that kid needs help, and so does the sister. Later on, the coordinator told me that the year before, they had to take away his drawings because he would draw pictures of kids bleeding and drew dead animals. Like, how many warning signs do you need? That kid needs help. There was this guy who grew up in the neighboring street as me, and he was just a really, really bad person. It doesn't sound like much now, but when he was about 11, he'd do things like borrow video games, never give them back, and then just swear blind he never borrowed them in the first place. This sounds minor, but it kind of went from there, really. As he got older, he'd start to steal money, beat the crap out of people for no reason, etc. His girlfriend took out a restraining order on him after they broke up because she was frightened of him. The best example I can give of what he was like was when he heard that someone had said something about him that he'd taken offense to. The person who'd done this was in the pub one afternoon with his wife and kids, and this guy walks into the pub, doesn't say a word, and just headbutts him in front of his family. But at the same time, he could be quite well-spoken and charming when he wanted something from somebody. And it's only recently occurred to me that he's obviously a sociopath. He's now living in a tent and addicted to H, and I think it was always going to go that way. There was a soldier in my unit who was a continual F-up, always in trouble. He had gotten a few Article 15s and things were moving towards general court-martial. He was restricted to post. So he decided that was a perfect time to hop in a car after drinking a bit too much, go roaring down a tiny rural road at about 70 and hit another car head-on. He lived, they didn't. He had absolutely no remorse. No remorse when he was recovering in the hospital, no remorse while in pre-trial confinement, no remorse when the verdict was read, no remorse when they put the cuffs on him and put him in the van that would take him to Leavenworth. In fact, he was spouting off about how the army screwed him over. F that scumbag. Yeah, I've heard of military service screwing some people up in the head, but it sounds like that guy had problems well before that he took into the military with him. Glad he's paying for his crime, at least. In high school, I helped my friend babysit a group of kids for a local church. The adults were doing some kind of Bible study, and there were about 6 to 7 children between the two of us babysitters. The main couple that were heading the group were the pastors of the church. The husband seemed a little weird, but mostly gave off pushover vibes, whereas the wife immediately made me feel uneasy. Something about her seemed off, like she was there but not entirely aware of other people or something, almost like she would be saying and doing everything in the exact same wooden way with or without anyone else there. This couple had 3 adopted kids, and one was a 5-year-old Russian boy that the mom literally referred to as the orphan a few times. She told my friend and I very blankly how we can't give in to his demands because he has little orphan boy syndrome, so don't give him any snacks or any privileges when he asks. The little boy definitely had some psychological and possible developmental issues, but was honestly one of the most endearing kids in that group and was nowhere near as creepy as the mom or the other 2 siblings made him out to be. The other 2 kept him at a distance and wouldn't directly speak to him but would talk to us to communicate with him, like staring me down with tunnel vision and telling me Victor needs to stop playing with his napkin, as Victor was right next to them trying to tell them something and waving his napkin at them. When the parents finished their Bible study, the dad came back in first and played with the kids, including the Russian one, and he seemed like a genuinely kind person that loved the kids. Then when the mom entered the room, the entire dynamic shifted, and the dad and 2 kids stopped interacting with the Russian kid and became much more formal. And the mom immediately began lecturing my friend and I about how the Russian kid was not to be playing with his sister's Legos. She said something to my friend about how this is the burden God has given this family and we must follow through with it now. This poor little kid definitely seemed to have issues, but the mom struck me as being an insidiously sadistic and abusive person. The way her voice never changed tone and her facial and bodily expressions and movements never wavered gave me the biggest case of the creeps. I wish my friend and I would have known better then and had reported this to CPS. I've always had a bad feeling about the situation and wish I would have acted better to help those poor kids. The mom seemed like she could have strangled one of them, then calmly kept making dinner as if absolutely nothing had just happened. Good golly. The "this is the burden God has given this family" line did it for me. That is one effed up, awful person. To say that about a child is just terrible. My old boss, superficially charming, obsessed by money, evil to the core. Just one tale amongst many. A colleague who had recently become a father was tragically killed in a motorcycle accident. Being a small, close-knit community in a foreign country, we rallied round and did as much as we could for the grieving widow. Our boss contacted her and told her that she would look after the child who would never want for anything, then tried to buy her. Our boss, rich, childless, and in her 50s, turned up at the house with a bag of money and tried to take the poor fatherless child from its mother and then, on being rebuffed, refused to help with any costs at all. The first time a human being made me sick. I was new working at a jail and read this one inmate's record. Was in for R-ing a woman then slitting her throat. She didn't die. Guy was talking to me once about his life. Yeah, I had a rough past, but I got straight, started a business, but some stuff happened that got me here, but that's not important, yada yada. Dude, you're a murdering artist. My stomach turned. This kid at my music camp when I was in middle school. He didn't really talk to anyone and always played his cello very aggressively. Rumor had it that he kicked a girl in the mouth for taking his pencil, that kind of kid. Fast forward a few days and I'm hanging out with my 2 friends at the waterfront and we see him throwing rocks at something. We ask what he's doing and he tells us that he's trying to knock a turtle off a log. A few tries later, he clocks it in the head and it falls off. That same day, he went up to a bunch of girls who find a tiny toad in the sand and asked to hold it. He apparently tried to crush it, but they took it back. The next day, he's at the waterfront again, poking something with a stick. My friends and I investigate, and he's poking a snake. I knew that it was poisonous, so I told him to stop, but he whacks me in the arm. A counselor ran over to break it up, but understandably forgot about the whole thing when he saw the snake, and just got us safely away from the snake. I grew up under the thumb of an abusive mother. Trigger warning, this is violent. I remember very starkly the first time she choked me. I don't remember what set her off, but she grabbed me by the back of my neck and threw me across the room and I landed on my back. I had a coughing fit because of how hard I hit the floor, and while coughing, I felt hands wrap around my throat. I opened my eyes to see her crouching over me, choking me. Her face was all twisted, but her eyes were different. Her eyes were all squished up in anger, but her actual eyeballs just seemed blank. She was so angry and so devoid of emotion at the same time. She just watched me sputter. I wound up passing out from her choking me. She left me there to wake up alone. I had bruises for a few weeks, a bruise all over my back, and my voice was gone for at least a week and a half. She never addressed it. I was maybe 8. I am safe now. Yesterday was a year since I cut contact, but I'll never forget that experience. That is both terrifying and heartbreaking. To think of a parent doing something like that to a child, and as a child, how do you ever fully recover from that kind of trauma and betrayal? I am so sorry you went through that. He was extremely nice and polite, but way too interested in talking to my daughter. Ended up telling her to scream if he ever tried to speak to her and to never go around him, and telling him that he had no business coming anywhere near her. He was my aunt's husband, and they were staying at my grandma's house while waiting for their house to be ready. Once they moved out, my cousin, his adult stepdaughter, admitted that he used to talk to her about her vagina on a daily basis and tell her that it smelled good. He absolutely radiated evil no matter what he looked or acted like. He also kept asking about our dogs, what to do if someone broke in. They will attack just like they're trained to do. What if someone had a weapon? Well, so do I. And my 4 guard dogs can smell you before you even get in the door. We changed to better/stronger locks. My dad. After a particularly bad fight with my mom where he ended up beating her nearly unconscious, he kidnapped my brother and I when we were toddlers while trying to avoid arrest. Not sure if my mom didn't charge him or what. As we were growing up, he started to beat my brother and I as well. He would act normal in front of his friends despite hitting us moments before they saw him. When I was 18, he tried to beat my brother who was fighting back and not allowing the beating to happen now that he was older and bigger. And when my dad started losing the fight, he broke a beer bottle against a wall and tried to stab my brother. I grabbed the pocket knife I was carrying and told my dad I'd stab him if he came any closer to my brother. My mom finally called the cops and they charged him with assault with a deadly weapon. The police sent him to a mental hospital for a week's evaluation as my family began packing our things so we could move in with other family by the time he was home. My entire family called the mental hospital and told them to be extremely careful when evaluating him. He had successfully manipulated people his entire life. My family packed our things and moved in with family he had never been met before. 3 days later, the mental hospital released him on good behavior and because he made a few cards to my mom explaining how he was going to be better and how he was sorry. On the way home from a mental hospital, he was spotted by a hardware store and bought multiple knives, a saw, and some rope. He put them in his backpack on top of his card, saying he was sorry and that he was going to be better from now on. He came home to an empty house unexpectedly. He messaged every family member asking us to forgive him and come home so we could talk things out. None of us responded. He used the rope to hang himself once he realized his plan to murder us had completely failed. I was not expecting just how sad so many of these would be, but I understand. I can hardly imagine much creepier for a person than to have someone who should be one of the most trusted people in your life be that much of a monster. I work in a K-12 school. Met a kindergartner whose eyes were just soulless. He wasn't rambunctious like the other kinders, calm and steady, but bad things always happened around him. Grade 3, he faked a murder scene in the forest behind the school and would take kids back there to freak them out. In grade 10, there were stories of him planning a school shooting. He was expelled and charged. But I believe now the charges are dropped. I've never once felt comfortable with him in the room. He's still a minor now. I'm worried about what he will be like as an adult. In all my years, I've never met a kid like him. We tried several social interventions on the school level. He was good at always giving the correct answer without any emotional response. Yes, a former patient of mine. I'm not squeamish-like at all, but that guy creeped me out. There was always a feeling of unease, of lurking danger. He didn't stare or anything conventionally creepy. He was so ill he couldn't move without assistance. Just that feeling, and it was worst when he finally died. I've seen my fair share of corpses, and usually there's a feeling of peace and okayness. Back then I worked with very old folks. Not with this guy, oh no. It was pure discomfort hitting you in the face. A kind of appalling wrongness and an overwhelming feeling that this guy was not going to a nice place. I almost believed that was hell looking at him, and I'm an atheist. What I found out a week later was almost relieving. He presumably killed his own baby boy because he was in the way. The older boy wasn't so much of a burden, but he gave him into a children's home for 2 years. all because he wanted to build a house in peace. His wife was in another ward at the same time suffering dementia, and she walked around all day with a little puppet you weren't allowed to touch, crying most of the time. His living son was as much at her side as he could be. He told us all of this. He said his mother had that puppet for years, always searching for his little brother. He also told us he's just so glad that his father was dead. He never said father or dad, he said the full name. His and his mother's life were pure torture, but he couldn't leave her alone with his father. He didn't even want to see him or anything. Late to the party, but my ex-wife's mother was a real-life Nurse Ratched. Same reptilian mannerisms, same condescending voice, same hair even. It was uncanny valley kind of crap because she was even a psychiatric nurse. Her own children told her right before surgery to remove a golf ball-sized brain tumor that if she wanted to make any changes to her personality, now was the time. They'd blame all her prior shenanigans on the tumor. To absolutely no one's surprise, she came out of the other surgery with her switch still flipped to evil. She spent the entirety of my relationship with my ex trying to break us up, and for all I know, she succeeded. Every time she looked at me, it was like she just scraped me off the bottom of her shoe. When her own mother complained about the car doing funny things while she was driving, she decided her mother was just going senile and imagining things, and took away her driving privileges, and therefore her last remaining vestige of independence. Well, my ex and I discovered around a year later a puddle of transmission fluid on the garage floor of her grandmother's house. It turned out the transmission had been slipping. Her grandmother died 3 years later. She changed the date of her daughter and my wedding around so many times that no one from my family was able to attend. One agreed-upon date was particularly objectionable because Sundays aren't for getting married, they're for going to church. One of the best outcomes of my ex leaving me is that I'll never have to see discount Nurse Ratched again for the rest of my life. Sounds like a person who was pretty miserable, but you have to wonder what made them that way. Was it how she was raised or something else? Who knows, but glad you got away. I was just a kid and my parents were visiting my dad's mom and half-brother. During our visit, my parents, siblings, and I took a trip to visit a man-made lake that my dad was curious about just out of town. While driving around it, Dad noticed his ex-stepdad's truck and he pulled over to see if he was around. Out popped my ex-grandfather and smiles as he embraces my dad. I'd never met the guy, but I'd heard a lot about him and knew that he and my grandmother had been divorced for a number of years. While ever curious about this man that was in half of my dad's years, I hopped out of the car to say hello. Just half a meter away, I felt pressure around my body and instantly felt the need to be alert. Frightened by the sensation, I grabbed onto my dad and timidly said hello before Dad quickly ended the conversation and took me to the car. A few years later, after reminiscing on memories, Dad told me he remembered that experience and told me that he noticed I felt the man's evil aura, and he felt the need to protect me. A little while later, as an adult listening to my dad and his siblings talk, I learned that he had been in prison for assault and that he also assaulted his children. For all I know, there's probably more disgusting things he's done that I have not been told. But his children that still hold his family name are in the process of taking on the surnames of my grandmother and her relatives, so they don't have anything that associated with him. Honestly, really glad that I learned all this in a timely way and that my dad had enough sense to notice I was uncomfortable. Good on your dad for noticing that. A lot of parents would have been like, "Hey, don't be rude, go give Grandpa a hug." Ugh. Back in February 2003, I was living in San Diego. My son was a toddler at the time, and we liked to go to the zoo or other places to check out animals and stuff on Fridays, my day off. That day, we were driving around Lakeside, California, where they have a lot of farms with horses and cows, etc. As we were driving back that afternoon, I pulled up at a stop sign in front of El Capitan High School. In front of me to the right at the corner was a man in flowing robes and long, unkempt hair. He looked like a religious prophet of some sort. Typical California. Nothing to see here, right? Then this guy turned to face me, and I saw pure effing evil coming from his eyes. I'm getting chills writing this now. All these years later, I can still see it. It's effing creepy as hell. Anyway, this guy was Brian David Mitchell, aka the Sick F who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. Crazy, deep, angry eyes. I pulled on past him, drove home, and thought nothing of it until Elizabeth was rescued a month later in Salt Lake City. Then the story came out that he had her locked up in the hills in the little town of Lakeside, California. Walked into a job interview, sat down across from an HR manager who had just the most scumball vibe I'd ever encountered. I'd heard the phrase, "he made my skin crawl" before, but never actually experienced it until that day. I ended up getting the job. And less than a year later, he'd been fired and charged with embezzling money from employee checks. Once he was gone, the quieter guys around the office admitted that they often felt like he was intimidating them, and a few of the women talked about how he had made unwanted advances, and they hadn't known what to do because he was the head of HR. Complete crap stain of a human being. Nothing quite like an evil boss, because if you try to go against them, you risk losing your job. I worked for someone who was a pretty awful person, and that can make an otherwise good job pretty miserable. My boss, she fought all the way to the top of the chain to be able to force a severely immunocompromised former coworker into working in a COVID unit. Her response to a patient punching me and me requesting to put a safety flag on his chart was, "But were you actually hurt?" Along with many other crappy things she does and petty effing comments she makes daily. Everyone bolts when they see her making her rounds. She doesn't have a single ounce of kindness in her body. Kid I shared a few classes with in middle school. I think we were both 13. He had a charming smile, but it always felt off to me like he was wearing a mask. There was nothing in his eyes when he smiled. He was in a lot of school groups, Kiwanis, Amnesty International, 4-H, Junior Civics Club, etc. If there was something to protest, he was the most outraged. If there was something to mourn, he was the saddest. If there was something to cheer, he was the loudest. But between those times, he was blank. If you were looking, he'd have a pleasantly neutral smile on his face. However, there were a few times I caught him when he thought no one was looking and he was just empty, cold. There was something just immensely soulfully chilling about him. One day he stopped showing up to school and no one knew why. Some of the girls in our class eventually went to his house to see if he was okay. Not me, I never wanted to be near him. It turns out he was the reason the neighborhood cats kept going missing. He got caught skinning a cat alive in an empty lot. The poor cat screaming caught the attention of someone and he was busted. When they went to check his room, they found his kill list. It included every animal, all pets that he had caught, tortured, and killed. The list was very detailed. No clue where they put him, but I sincerely hope he never gets out. Edit to add, I asked a friend about it who was a neighbor of the family to make sure I was right in what happened. Apparently, he also helped look for the missing animals, both dogs and cats, and had a grief scale. It measured on a scale of 1 to 5 how sad someone was and how they acted. No one knew why he tracked that, and I'm sure I don't want to know. As a very vocal lover of my 2 dogs, I hope that person rots. I know I should want someone to receive help, but that is absolutely monstrous. And now I need to go pet my pups for a bit before I keep reading. My neighbor. Something was off. She was a skinny, frail, mid-30s woman with a son. The son was about 8 to 9. He was off as well, something just not right and eerie. They were always trying to make small talk at the fence when getting into my car or in the front yard. One day the kid says, "Help, come, I think someone is trying to break in," to which I replied, "Did you call 911? He said no, then I replied, "Where's your mom?" He said, "Inside." The kid badgered me to come inside and check. I pretty much said, "No way, your mom is in there." In my head, "You guys are crazy. And if she don't care to move, then must be just fine." Anyway, they move out. A few months later, she's in the news. She had a chopped up body in her freezer. When they moved, it thawed a bit before cooling at the new residence, and the scent drew some attention and was discovered. I can see the evil in her smile 5 years later. Working at a car rental place years ago, a couple came in and I helped set them up in their rental. I don't remember what they said or even looked like, but I very clearly remember feeling terrified. My heart was racing and I was scanning my surroundings to plan my escape. They were pleasant on the surface, but something about them kicked me into fight or flight mode. I remember worrying about being there when they returned to their car. I even felt on guard for weeks afterward, worried I would run into them in public. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it now, and it's been close to 10 years ago. In a separate incident, a guy came in frantic to rent a car ASAP but had no credit card or proof of residence. When he was at the counter trying to give us cash, we noticed his fingertips were all burnt. It looked like he had dipped them in acid. Heaven only knows what crazy crap he had been involved in. That was terrifying. There were only 2 of us working that day, myself and a very pregnant coworker. He paced back and forth for about 10 minutes before finally leaving. We locked the doors after that. My stepfather was evil personified. He was an alcoholic who drank massive amounts of alcohol without passing out, and he hid his drinking from my mother before they married. He had been married 3 times before, but only told us about one. My sister, who was 14 years old, nearly 15 years old, was immediately the scapegoat and treated badly. He would watch her get into and out of the bathtub. When he put his hand down her panties and tried to R her, she begged our mother for help. She slapped my sister for trying to steal her man. My sister was able to get an older brother to take her in 150 miles away. They left me alone at home at almost 11. He had been trained by the Marines as an interrogator, translate to torturer. He decided to use me to maintain his skills and to toughen me up. My mother knew, actually watched, and laughed. I've required multiple surgeries and lots of therapy. Eventually, my mother kicked him out. He stuffed rags into the chimney to try and kill us with carbon monoxide. He took a job at my school so that I would have to see him regularly. I think this qualifies as pure evil. Gonna go ahead and put your mom on that list as well. I am so sorry what you and your sister had to go through. Anyone out there, if you are in a situation like this, find an adult you can trust and try to get help. I know it doesn't always end well. No system is perfect, but staying with people like this is even more dangerous. There was a kid I met in high school that I remember instantly hating just by looking at him. I'm not a violent person, never been in a fight in my life, but as soon as I saw this kid, I wanted to bash his face in. And that feeling persisted all throughout school. He was kind of a bully ringleader, but never really put himself in a position to get in trouble. Also was a rich kid, so was pretty instantly popular. Years after high school, I read in the paper that he got arrested with large quantities of drugs and unregistered guns in his car after attempting to shoot his parents. I remember the kid always had this really punchable smirk on his face. Think like Joffrey from Game of Thrones, but in real life and not acting. Always laughing at the misfortune of others, often causing it by goading his friends into bullying people. I was 6'2", 240 pounds in high school, so they never really messed with me, but the group was big enough that they probably could have kicked my butt if they had wanted to. I just kept my distance. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.